This is CyberSound, your simplified and fundamentals-focused source for all things cybersecurity.
Welcome to CyberSound. I'm your host, Jason Pufahl, joined in studio today by Steve Maresca. Steve always loves he loves emphasis. And virtually or remotely by Michael Grande.
Hello.
Hey.
Good afternoon, everybody.
Steve doesn't even know what to say today. He's like, I don't even want to talk.
I'm the quiet one.
So we've done a couple of rewinds, and this is different than that though. We recorded, I think our very first episode was actually security fundamentals, and then we re-recorded that maybe a couple of years later. I think it was June of 2022, where, I mean, candidly, I think the information was largely the same. Our production capabilities were better, so we wanted to make sure we brought that one back. But it's been 2.5 years, almost 3, since we recorded, and we wanted to kind of revisit those security fundamentals. I think what, Steve, you're calling them the security fundamentals improved or security revamped?
Yeah, or evolved.
Evolved.
So some of these things are evergreen, but the reality is the world has changed.
Right. So
It's almost like, daylight saving times comes. You got to check the batteries in your smoke alarms. Well, it's somewhat. What are you doing? What are the fundamentals that you've implemented? Right. It's like a regular status check.
Yeah.
Except here, the smoke alarms are moving around, and you have to find them again.
That's true.
That.
That's true.
So we're gonna tackle this really in 2 parts. The one part really is there are things that we expect now that most people probably have done, and frankly, there's still the foundation to I'll call it a basic security program that everybody has to be doing. So we want to cover that. In the event that you aren't already doing these things, we'll continue to reemphasize that you need to. But then I think a lot of it is, what's the evolution look like? And are there new things that you have to be paying attention to or should be doing, right? So looking back, we'll just sort of tackle these one by one. Certainly patching and addressing known vulnerabilities remains a constant. Right.
Always. It's the baseline expectation that systems are kept up to date. It's a business requirement. It's a best practice for security. Everyone that isn't doing it is probably in that position because they've had some oversight, not because they are ignoring it today.
Right.
It might have been a less common practice in the past.
But I mean, that's bread and butter. I mean, there's tools in place to do it. A lot of the applications, operating systems, they do it on their own already anyway. It should be really straightforward. Going back to the discussion we had around, sort of the ROI of these threat actors, they look for known vulnerabilities to exploit.
Right.
Plain and simple.
If the door's open, it's easy waltzing
That's
in.
it.
So deny that opportunity.
Yeah.
Credential management is really the next thing, and this is about authentication and authorization. Since 2020, almost every organization on the planet's implemented multi-factor authentication, 2-step authentication, whatever you call it, and that's great. If it's not in place, it's an oversight, and it's right now just a base expectation. Right. Candidly, the part of the conversation to follow is the fact that the landscape has changed, our controls are working, and how do we react to that? And we'll talk about that in a minute.
I guess we still are talking about security awareness training, and
that never goes away.
It doesn't, and it's becoming increasingly, in my opinion, increasingly important. A lot of the conversations we have are less about, do you have a security control in place, but is it more, do your employees understand what to do if there's an issue, how to respond to an inquiry that is unanticipated, recognizing phishing and social engineering, all of that stuff.
Here's the thing. Security controls and investments implemented are working. Because they're working, the training of personnel and behavior matters more.
Right, for sure.
And multi-factor authentication is a really good example of that.
This security awareness training, the process has been streamlined. It's an easy implementation generally now, right, across an organization. So, there's almost no excuse not to implement some sort of a program.
Yeah, it's just making sure people do it. I mean, I think that remains really one of the challenges. You can always get people at onboarding, harder to get people in the company to do it. And how do you make it front and center, and how do you make it valuable?
Right, exactly.
So,
yeah.
So the other, baseline expectation is backing up data. Business critical information needs to be housed in an appropriate location and preserved. If it's not there, you don't have it in the case of an emergency if you need to rebuild. And if you do have it, every security incident that an organization is likely to face becomes a relatively quick thing to recover from. I think most orgs understand that today, and it's a matter of sustaining what they've already put in place from a data backup perspective.
So I agree. Everybody knows to back up. And I don't know if everybody knows to test it all the time. So I feel like that's probably, for me, sort of a takeaway. Like you may have put your backup process in place a couple of years ago. Are they still working? Are you still getting the data you want? I think we'll talk a little bit about knowing where your data is in a minute. I feel like that's a critical piece.
Yeah, validation of the data that's stored to make sure it's actually there when you do a restoration. It's now an expectation. Cyber liability insurance will ask for that. When did you do your last backup restoration test? If you haven't, now's the time to get to that level of refinement.
Okay. And then probably EDR is the most, in my opinion, almost the most common tool that we see deployed now. It's required by cyber liability insurance, a whole variety of other reasons. I think most people have implemented that at this point, right? So our discussion is much more, are you using a good tool, and are you collecting the data out of it that you need to and reviewing that data?
Right. This is a budgetary decision in many cases. Organizations that deploy EDR that were middle of the market maybe have some gaps from the perspective of capability. When we do a pen test, it's pretty common for some of our tactics to be unobserved. With a top-of-line EDR or even market, top quadrant type EDR, you're not having that problem. You detect the attack early. So now it's more about refining what is in place and making sure it's appropriate.
Okay. So, all the things that we talked about, I'll say over the last 4 or 5 years, they all remain. We're seeing a lot more adoption, no question about it. Better implementation in general, and now, in a sense, it's time to ramp it up a little bit, a little bit more, right? So moving then from, I'll call it just a total controls space, more to a what are you supposed to do as an organization space, right? And that's our policy.
Yeah. So what we talked about before, that's block and tackling basics. Organizations now are broadly expected to have acceptable use policies, an information security policy, and a written information security program, documentation to basically say, here's our specification of what we organizationally think we are supposed to be doing. Here is what we expect of our employees, and here's how we safeguard data. Yeah. If that type of material doesn't exist, it really, in my opinion, impedes demonstration of value to business partners. Yep. And it has the net effect of looking like a greater risk from a liability standpoint. So build the policies. It will help with a huge number of compliance and reputational elements, just to show we're doing the right thing.
Okay. So a quick point on sort of policy development, and I know it's a key deliverable, in a lot of our different engagements that we have. But depending on the sophistication of the client, one of the concerns, and I've had this conversation with different folks in the past, is, well, isn't this an automated thing? Can't I use Can't I use an AI to develop a policy for me and just have it? So, I check that box.
Right.
Maybe just spend a second talking about the importance of the relevance of customization to a certain extent, right? Developing these policies, pursuant to what your business is.
So it's a very important point to raise, because there are lots of policy templates and libraries that exist. They tend to be generic or, catch-all policies that don't apply to all business types. You don't want a 40-page policy for an organization of 20 people. It doesn't make sense. You want something practical and attuned to the type of business. Similarly, if you have a generated policy from a template, it may reference regulations that don't have anything to do with the business in question. There's additional risk where, the policy that you grab off the shelf includes stipulations that the org must fulfill, things that are frankly inappropriate for the data that they deal with. They produce audit findings when policy is on the books that isn't backed up by actual implementation or procedure. It's really an important point to stress, because a lot of policies are not just pieces of paper. An auditor will come in expecting that there's evidence that the policy language is being followed. So customizing something, attuning to the business, and understanding whether it's appropriate for purpose is the necessary step to avoid quite a few negative outcomes otherwise.
Right.
We tend to make small policies that are appropriate for staff and business rather than something really large, because it's just asking for trouble.
Right. So you talked about this a little bit more when we were planning for this, around the idea of data flow, data inventory. I actually argued about it a tiny bit. Where
you did?
Yeah, because I think it's important, and I was trying to reconcile that with some of those more basic controls. So maybe spend a minute on that, because you convinced me.
Well, so we're out of the realm of basic controls. We're into refinement, and most organizations have a sense of the data that they process or store or need to use for their business. What they don't necessarily do a good job of doing is saying exactly where that data is stored, in what volume, and in what type that data is. So case in point for why that's important. If you have a breach or a security incident, you're probably bringing in a third party. That entity needs to understand very quickly where your key data and your key systems are. And if you don't have that in a simple spreadsheet, you need to reconstruct that on the fly. A business and all of the people in it might know that the file server on the P drive stores all of the finance data, and the H drive stores the human resources data, but everybody's different. Merely having a map of where everything is hugely beneficial. The attackers are looking for it anyway. You might as well equip yourselves with some understanding of where it's going and where it's coming from. And in that notion, also documenting where data enters and exits the organization is a really important thing. Yeah. So flow and where it's stored. Those are the two things that really are intrinsically important. And it's not a huge lift. If you have an asset inventory, servers, workstations, applications, add another column, indicate what type of data is there. It's done.
Yeah, and I think what convinced me really is, and we've said this, I was just trying to think if it truly was like a fundamental control or not, but it's just easy to protect data when you know where it is,
right,
rather than just kind of blindly trying to protect everything.
So major issue in an incident is the latent data that sits on workstations and stuff like that. You have to go find that after the incident to say, we have to notify these people or not.
Yeah.
If you know ahead of time that a particular department stores data locally or in a particular file share, it just is an opportunity to reduce risk and a way of getting to a conclusion faster in an incident. Yeah. That's why.
Totally reasonable. So
shifting back again to security awareness training, it's a good segue from data.
Yeah.
Most security awareness training talks very briefly about, phishing, how to identify suspicious messages. That's great. But it doesn't often get into how people are supposed to behave around data use. Security awareness training addressing that will absolutely bolster the previous subject. And furthermore, give you a sense of, what's important to particular roles.
Right.
That's what's often missing. Training for your finance people, training for your HR folks in particular, because they are targets.
Yep. Yeah, and more often we see just generalized security awareness training. I mean, there's certainly your computer-based training. I don't know if there's a better way to describe it, but there's modules for business units. A lot of the in-person training is a little more challenging because you're typically doing larger groups. So how do you actually compartmentalize that a little bit better?
And it's obligatory in some cases. If you're collecting or processing credit cards, your people in that role need to have PCI DSS specific training about how they preserve cardholder data.
Yeah. If they're insider threat for CMMC.
Absolutely.
Right? Yeah, some of them.
If it's not being done, it's quite literally a compliance failure.
Yeah.
And, talking about the evolution of controls, and, I know many organizations see it, but sort of enhancing those general financial controls that exist within any size business, with dual control authority. A lot of banks are implementing, positive payment systems now to verify that there's actually the intended recipient is where the money needs to be going. I don't know how many cases I've seen of this where it feels like, the bad actors are crawling LinkedIn They're looking for new additions to each company. They're taking
Sure.
advantage of that with targeted phishing attacks to say, hey, this is a new employee just hired. They just made an announcement on LinkedIn. Let's target this person and possibly if they have any financial authority in an organization. So, keeping an eye and refreshing those things and working with your financial institution is really important as well, because those things they're constantly evolving and changing, and financial, monetary damages can add up very fast from a direct issue that can come about, wire fraud, etc.
And difficult to recover.
Right. And often unrecoverable.
Right.
This is a situation where many orgs are doing the right thing at the moment, but it's because the people know from on-the-job experience, and that's not the same as training against it and having a procedure that's been documented that a new guy can follow. That's the absolute necessity here.
Yeah, and your point when we were discussing this is, there are so many of the controls that remain constant, but because now companies are doing such a better job at implementing, backups and MFA and EDR, that the attackers are getting more sophisticated, which is really the prompt for the evolution of this.
Right, and to expand on the financial controls aspect, we saw an attack recently where there's no urgent or particularly easy to detect phishing chain that precedes them. They are gradual. They interact in a benign and believable manner and build credibility and basically manufacture a behavior in accounts payable personnel based upon very capable deception.
Yeah.
That's the way things are working today. It's not just a, hey, we changed our bank account, please update it kind of message any longer.
Yeah.
So it just drives home the point.
I think, that really concludes today. The transcript will always be there. It's easy enough to look at the items in sort of written format. Not a substantive change really over the last 4 or 5 years. Really, it's just some additions and some, call it, improved practices. And we're seeing cyber liability insurance. We're seeing regulatory expectations shift a bit. Kind of the reason we added a couple of these elements in there.
Absolutely.
So as always, thanks for listening. We appreciate it. If you have any questions, reach out to us. Thank you.
We'd love to hear your feedback. Feel free to get in touch at Vancord on LinkedIn. And remember, stay vigilant, stay resilient. This has been CyberSound.